In this lecture, we're going to explore theories of multiple homicide, and we're going to explore theories that you should be familiar with, but in this chapter, we're going to apply them specifically to multiple homicide. So, sociological theories contend that criminals are not born, but instead they're shaped by the social environment. So in 1938, Merton argues that the American culture emphasizes economic success without emphasizing the means for attaining it. And this is the beginning of strain theory. And he basically says that a lot of people lack access to the means necessary to improve their socioeconomic status. And so some Americans, in turn, innovate. They use illegitimate means to attain success. So they still want to obtain the American dream, wealth and monetary success, but they're going to do so in illegal means. So the DC snipers were people who had already committed a series of armed robberies. And when they were trying to negotiate an end to their killing spree, they wanted to get $10 million from the authorities. In 1992, Agnew talks about general strain theory, and Agnew talks about negative experiences in our social relationships. This can be home, school, work, and that when this leads to frustration and anger in particular, that people often cope with negative coping skills and illegal coping skills. He talks about 3 types of strain: the failure to achieve goals, loss of social status, and the gap between our aspirations and our achievements. And this theory can be pretty useful in explaining middle school and high school students who go on a rampage. If you think about how kids that age evaluate their success, right, it's often popularity with peers. So many of them have been bullied and teased, and some have even been traumatized, come from broken homes, or have experienced abuse. So in Virginia Tech, Sung-Hee Cho was diagnosed with a severe anxiety disorder and major depression. He was ignored by his peers and bullied by others, and that sense of rejection really grew. Social learning theory says that people learn to kill. They learn all criminal behavior from the interactions they have with other people. And this could certainly be applied to killing as well. So in 1984, Cressy expands upon Sutherland and says that criminal behavior comes from differential association with groups of people who reinforce positive attitudes towards crime and teach us the skills associated with it. Akers expands upon this and says that impact of interacting with people who commit crimes and have positive attitudes towards crimes really varies. So how much impact that has on us depends on the frequency of those relationships, the duration of them, the intensity of them, and the priority we give them. So social learning is stronger when individuals perceive they're likely to be rewarded for their behavior. Close friends and family who are admired and respected often serve as role models, and we often will then imitate and emulate their criminal behavior. But also well-publicized crimes can also serve as models for criminal behavior. So it doesn't always have to be people with whom we actually have a relationship with. Military backgrounds can also provide an effective learning experience for violence and killing. And so we know that Columbine has served as an inspiration for some mass killers because they have either, left that information behind in journal writings or mentioned it to other people. Routine activities theory says that everyday situations offer opportunities for victimization, that when we have an available target, a motivated offender, and a lack of capable guardians, that's when we can see a crime happen. And so these events might even influence our choice of victims. So for instance, when we think about James Holmes, why did he choose a packed cinema? His grievance had more to do with the fact that he was failing he was not successful in his graduate program. He chose the only cinema in Colorado where firearms were explicitly banned, and there were also no armed guards on premises. So he can have a much bigger impact there than he could in another location. Control theory talks about our commitment and attachment to conventional people and institutions. And that commitment to other people prevents us basically from committing violent crime. So Freud talks about how we really develop our superego. And he says that before the age of 5 or 6, children really follow rules and don't hurt other people because they're looking to be rewarded and to avoid punishment. But they start to identify with their parents and imitate their parents in order to please them. And this is where we start to internalize and adopt our beliefs. So the presence of a superego should ensure that we grow up with enough self-control to not commit extreme violence. Hershey says criminality is controlled by our commitments and attachments to conventional people. Basically, we refrain from bad behavior because we don't want to lose our relationships with others. Gottfredson and Hershey expand upon this in 2003 with their general theory of crime, and they talk about the role of parents in parental supervision and consistent discipline, and that's really important in developing our sense of self-control. Sampson and Laub talk about life trajectories and the ability of people to develop connections through informal bonds. And that includes our jobs and our career relationships, and that these are things that might protect us from committing criminal acts. And so researchers are noting that Americans have really suffered sharp declines in social bonds, and also that most mass murderers lack social control. They feel alone in a hostile environment. So take Adam Lanza, for example, who was the shooter at Newtown. He lacked the sources of social control because he had serious mental illness and a reclusive lifestyle. Psychological theories are really looking at things that are happening on an individual level. And most offenders are rarely clinically or legally insane. About 12 to 15% of mass murderers are psychotic. And it's very important that we understand the difference between some types of mental illness and when someone is actually psychotic or having a psychotic break. So most offenders are aware that they're breaking the law or they're doing something wrong. So they're not psycho, but they're psychopaths. They often have deficits in processing emotions and relating to others. And so some combination of personality disorders then underlies the fact that many of these killers have no empathy and are often impulsive. But their behavior these personality disorders are not considered mental illnesses that would make one not responsible for their behavior. So personality disorders do not make one insane for legal purposes. So we often hear three phrases used interchangeably: psychopath, sociopath, and then the clinical diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder. So in 1941, Cleckley noted 16 symptoms that included disinhibited behavior, superficial charm and intelligence, low anxiety and fearlessness, lack of insight, remorse, and empathy. And in 1964, McCord add aggression, impulsivity, parasitic exploitation and manipulation of others, and callousness to that list. And then Robert Hare develops the PCLR, the Psychopath Checklist Revised. And Hare says about 1% of the population is psychopathic, and they're thought to account for over 50% of all crimes. And the disorder basically predisposes one to crime, but many just channel it into manipulative, ruthless behavior, and not all of people who have, not all psychopaths are committing violent crimes. So when we describe these people, they're unnaturally calm, cool, and collected during stressful events. They're adept at reading people and playing with their emotions. It's often referred to as a life of charm and harm. They present as intelligent and a charismatic facade that they can use to lure victims in and evade suspicion. They have an inability to feel love, empathize with pain of others, feel guilt, and accept responsibility for actions. Now think about if you had those characteristics. It would be very easy for you to kill without any emotion related to it. So some people argue that psychopathy and sociopathy are different. I would argue they're not. The basic argument is that psychopathy is more biological and sociopathy is more environmental, where that develops through traumatic events, whereas a psychopath is born without empathy. So some would say then that highly intelligent, organized, manipulative killers who score high on the PCLR are true psychopaths, whereas antisocial murderers without impulse control are sociopaths. But that lack of empathy is probably necessary in order to avoid apprehension, and that's really the hallmark trait when we think about psychopathy. We're talking about a lack of empathy. So Halburn studied 168 male prisoners in Georgia and said that there are two types of psychopaths. One is that sociopathic type. They have poor impulse control, low IQ, and little empathy. And the other is more that psychopathic type. Better impulse control, high IQ, sadistic objectives, and heightened empathy. And this group with heightened empathy actually tended to be more violent. And if you think about the fact that they're sort of getting off on that violence, they have to have some level of empathy in order to understand that they're inflicting pain and in order to get off on that. Antisocial personality disorder is traits similar to the PCLR factor 2. This is a failure to conform to social norms, deceitfulness, impulsivity, aggressiveness, irresponsibility, and lack of remorse. And this is an umbrella diagnosis for several subgroups, and psychopathy kind of falls underneath that. So Hare says that most common criminals have antisocial personality disorder, but only about 20% would meet the criteria for psychopathy. Many killers don't even come close to the threshold for psychopathy. For example, Dahmer only scored 22 on the PCLR. Now, another personality disorder is narcissistic personality disorder. These people have fantasies of superiority, delusions of grandeur, have a need for admiration and obedience, and the lack of empathy. This is not always linked with violent behavior, but triggering events of intense inner pain or humiliation can cause a narcissist to use violence to prove their superiority, increase their self-esteem, and regain respect. Borderline personality disorder, on the other hand, is the primary personality disorder for multiple murderers. Okay? So narcissism and psychopathy may just encourage violence, but BPD is an instability in one's sense of self, emotional, and interpersonal relationships. And it's frequently associated with intense fear of abandonment, feelings of emptiness, and suicidal or self-harming behavior. So these people have difficulty controlling their impulses, they have very black and white thinking, and they often engage in violent behavior. And this is probably about 50% of murderers. And many psychologists believe then that borderline personality disorder would exacerbate psychopathy. So it would basically lower the threshold for committing murder. Now, we can also look at autism spectrum disorders and schizoid personality disorder. So ASD is an impairment in social interaction, lack of empathy, preoccupation with restricted and bizarre interests, and a mechanical body posture. Now, this probably isolates children and can allow them to retreat into a fantasy world, and this could promote the development of abnormal sexual fantasies and homicidal urges. Okay. Now, one researcher found a high probability diagnosis of ASD in 21 multiple murderers and a possible diagnosis for an additional 33 killers. But the link between ASD and violence is tenuous, and most of these studies are not very rigorous in their methodology. Some scholars are going to look then at SPD, schizoid personality disorders, solitary lifestyle, disinterest in interpersonal relationships, lack of empathy, emotional coldness. So these people may be so disconnected that they have to be taught emotions of others in order to learn empathy. Now, another disorder here would be dissociative identity disorder, and this is what used to be called multiple personality disorder, and it's a result of severe childhood abuse. An individual fragments their personality into several alters, and that helps protect them from psychological trauma. But the link between this and multiple murder is murky at best. This is a disorder that's 9 times more common in women, yet the majority of mass murderers are men. We can also think about biological theories. So looking at genetic factors, there's no genes that have been linked to multiple homicide, but about 50% of the variation in our antisocial behavior can be attributed to genetics, and so far we have about 7 genes linked to antisocial behavior. We also know that empathy is partially heritable and linked to 14 genes. Furthermore, we know from criminology that poor parenting is one of the leading causes of delinquency, and up to 25% of the variation in parenting practices is genetic in origin. Now, another thing that we look at in terms of biology is neurotransmitters, and one is MAOA, and this is an regulator of how our brain communicates. It's located on the X chromosome, which makes men more susceptible to this condition. Because men only have one X chromosome, if something's wrong with the first copy, if it's ineffective, they don't have a backup copy, whereas women would. Caspi found about 12% of the population had low MAOA activity, and they were responsible for nearly half of all crime. They also found that 85% of maltreated low MAOA children developed some form of antisocial behavior. Teowen found a significant relationship between low activity MAOA gene and offenders who committed at least 10 violent acts. We might also look at brain dysfunction, and Blair has suggested that the primary dysfunction related to psychopathy has to do with the amygdala. This is the area of our brain responsible for emotional processing. Individuals who have damage here or that is a dysfunction here would have a low startle response and sensitivity to pain. So psychopaths don't scare easily and they don't try to avoid pain. They also have difficulty processing emotions, and it takes more effort for them to interpret emotional statements and understand facial cues. Others have looked at executive dysfunctions. So the executive functioning comes from the prefrontal cortex of your brain, which is the main source of our decision making. So people with issues with their executive functions would be irresponsible, thrill seekers, and generally impulsive. So it could be that the psychopath's emotions are normal, but their control of them is not. Rain found that the volume of gray matter in prefrontal cortex of psychopaths was significantly lower, and that these people were basically cold-blooded. They had lower heart rates, less fear, and less anxiety when stressed. So they do not fear getting caught or punished, which of course would call to mind that deterrence wouldn't work with this group. So it's possible then that our decision-making processes are linked to brain abnormalities. But this still has to occur in combination with other environmental conditions to actually place us at risk for brutality. So this could include things like adoption under bad circumstances, extreme shyness, disfigurement, speech impediments, disabilities, abandonment, etc.